Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning? Welcome to a very special episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast, a student-led project where we explore the history and human stories shaping the Middle East conflict. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Efe.
Today, we're turning to a chapter of history often overlooked in public conversation, but central to understanding the Middle East as it is today. The flight and expulsion of Jews from the Arab world and Iran between the late 1940s and the 1970s. Before 1948, roughly 1 million Jews lived across the Middle East and North Africa, in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Tunis, Aleppo, and Sana'a, some in communities dating back more than 2,000 years. Within just a generation, about 850,000 of them had left or been forced to leave. This wasn't simply a migration. It was a seismic shift, a transformation in the demographic, cultural, and political fabric of entire countries. Here's why it's so important to our conversation today. More than half of the Jewish population of Israel today has roots in the Middle East and North Africa. Their story is not an aside to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's woven into its core. To help us unpack this history, we're joined by one of the world's leading authorities on Jewish life in the Islamic world, Professor Stillman. Stillman is a Professor Emeritus of Judaic History at the University of Oklahoma. He's the author of The Jews of Arab Lands and The Jews of Arab Lands in Modern Times, seminal works that have shaped scholarship for decades. He also served as the founding editor of the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World, the most comprehensive reference on the subject ever assembled. His research spans Muslim-Jewish relations, Judeo-Arabic culture, and the Sephardic history, and generations of students and scholars have learned from his meticulous work. If you've studied this history in any serious way, chances are you've leaned on his books before. For us, it's an incredible honor to have him here. A very warm welcome, Professor Stillman. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. I'm honored as well.
Also from me, a very warm welcome.
Diving right into the first questions. By the 1930s and 40s, global politics were turning dark. Did the rise of fascism impact anti-Semitic sentiment in Arab countries?
Simple answer, yes. First of all, and forgive me, I wear hearing aids,
No problem.
I tell my wife I hear very well. She disputes that. In any case, yes, fascism has a very important role. The Nazis have radio broadcasts every day in Arabic to the Arabic-speaking world. After the Mufti flees Baghdad, when the British come back in 1941, he himself does broadcasts to the Arab world. But meanwhile, they've been doing it all along. Remember, there was a large German community, expatriate community in Cairo. Goebbels' brother lived in Egypt. He was one of the heads of the German community of Cairo. Needless to say, they were quite active. You had, even though, and you had in many other places as well, the Italian fascism was attractive in the sense that it was militant, single rule. In and of itself, remember, fascism wasn't terribly anti-Jewish at first. There were Jews in Italy that supported Mussolini. It becomes later on. And yes, but we have, for example, in Libya, which was, remember, ruled by the Italians. I have a letter. I publish it in Jews of Arab Lands in Modern Times in the reading section. The governor, Balbo, writes to Mussolini and says, "Look, if we put in all these racial laws, we're not going to have anybody working in the hospitals who can speak to the native patients. We're not going to have anybody in government offices who can speak to the natives or read documents." He said, after all, the Jews are already a dead people. Why do we have to go any further? He gets a letter back. You know what's best and what we need in the colony, so you make the decisions. And then this is a secretary has typed this, but then in Mussolini's own handwriting, there's a postscriptum in which he says, "But by the way, when the Jews may appear to be dead people, but they never really are." And 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 by the way, the Italians were never as efficient as the Germans. And Italo Balbo, the governor, his plane is accidentally shot down by gunners from the ground when he was flying near Egypt, thinking that perhaps it was mistakenly that it was an Allied plane. But fascism, the tone of fascism, yes, but the not. And by the way, Hitler's Mein Kampf was translated into Arabic, but with all of the he said Arabs are no better than half-naked apes who know only the taste of the lash. And that's all excerpted from the Arabic translation. It's only the anti-Jewish stuff, which is the majority that in the Arabic. And by the way, Mein Kampf was still a bestseller in the Arab world in the 1970s, as were the protocols. But again, this is a modern phenomenon.
One of the most brutal incidents was the Farhud pogrom in Baghdad, 1941. What sparked it? What exactly happened? And what was its lasting impact on Iraqi Jewry? Following that, were there comparable outbreaks of violence or other forms of increasing discrimination in other Arab countries before Israel's creation?
All right. Number one, yes, it was a terrible incident. It occurred just as after the Mufti and the Iraqi nationalist, Arab nationalist government all fled the country. The British were at the borders of Baghdad. They had already conquered the southern part of Iraq, and the army was there. And the regent, remember, because the king is only a boy at this time, I forget how old he was, but he was younger than you are, I'm sure. In any case, the regent and the king come back, and the British decide they are not. And Jews, of course, who had meanwhile Iraq for 6 months became an ally of Nazi Germany. Also the German ambassador, who was a major force, also leaves at this time. The Jews. It's also the eve of a Jewish holiday. There's the tomb of the prophet Jeremiah is right outside the city, and the Jews go to welcome back the regent of the royal family, and on the way, Iraqi soldiers attack them. Iraqi soldiers who, remember, up until this moment were serving the nationalists who were ruling, and this then breaks out into a widespread pogrom. Mobs enter the Jewish section of Baghdad. They destroy property. They kill nearly 200 people, injure many, many others. And what's amazing is the British, who are right there, don't enter the city to stop this. And we have letters from the archives, the British archives. I remember seeing these letters where British officers writing that they felt helpless because they didn't want to make it look as if the regent and the king were coming back with the British hand. And therefore, they allowed this to go on all day, through the night, and only the next day, the regent sent in Kurdish troops from the north to put down the pogrom. The death and destruction was in the hundreds of thousands of British pounds, which, by the way, would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. And this had a lasting impact. A year later, we see over 1,000 requests for visas to British India from Baghdad alone. And by the way, a visa request was not for an individual; it was for an entire family. And remember, we're talking about large families. So we're talking about many thousands of people. They were mostly turned down. But there was this a sense of unease. Many Iraqi Jewish writers, in their recollections, their novels, and so on, some of them which are made movies. You can see them. Eli Amir's, who else? Several others, and these novels are translated into many languages. His novels, The Pigeon Breeder. In any case, you have the UN vote for the partition of Palestine, you have other anti-Jewish incidents breaking out, and Jews are in great fear. They're also have been declared to be non-loyal, even though they are again discreetly not taking public part in the debate. But in any case, at a certain point, the Iraqis decide better to get rid of them. They allow Jews to sign up for emigration, not necessarily to Palestine. Majority do at the time. Of the 120,000, about 100,000 do. But they lose their property. They can only take a small amount. And then there are these flights that go back and forth. Operation, not Magic Carpet. That's the one from Yemen. That fly them constantly back and over into at first to Cyprus, but then if even directly. And those who stay behind are hopeful that somehow they've proven their loyalty and so on. It doesn't work. The restrictions on Jews become harsher and harsher. And now, of course, you're down to some 20-odd people who are left in the Jewish community of Baghdad. In Syria, the number is down, I think, to 5 or 4. And that really is sparking the end of Jewish life. Now, as for violence, before, yes, you have waves of riots that break out in Tripoli, Libya, in Benghazi, also in Libya, in which people are killed and so on and so forth. And again, Libya, remember, has been under even at the end of World War II. You have riots in Cairo. against Jews, and by the way, against then Copts and Greeks. Remember, Egypt had a Greek population going back to Alexander the Great. You had 60 or 80,000 Greeks in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s. And that begins to decline precipitously when we get into the 1970s and 1980s. And now, again, the number is very small. But that's another thing that made Egypt different. Egypt was a very cosmopolitan place where you had many different ethnic groups living there, Italians and so on, and who had been there for generations. We're not talking about people who just came in for business and so on, but people who had been there and considered themselves Egyptian Greeks, Egyptian, and so on and so forth. But again, with modern nationalism, that kind of ethnicity no longer was something that was tolerated to a great extent. But yes, you had violence in lots of places, and then of course with the War of Independence after the partition, then of course the Arab League of course fostered this and so on. And one of the least, I know it sounds hard to be I'm an optimist by nature, which I always explain to colleagues is far better than being a pessimist. Because if you're wrong, it's going to be either after you're gone that it comes out, or B, it's only near the end, and so you've had a much better life meanwhile. But I do believe, I'm a sincere optimist, and things like the Abraham Accords, all of the what I hear on in the Arab media, read in the press, at least some branches of it, of the Arab world, are basically give me hope. And also, I have many former students from the Arab world, colleagues, or people whom I've never met but whose research I've assisted and so on, who've written to me how heartbroken they were after October 7th and what happened with Hamas. And again, then of course you have the counter, and it goes back and forth. But there are positive signs. So I do hope that you'll come away from all of this thinking, yes, there have been good times and bad times, and Deo Volente will get to better times.
How did the Holocaust affect Jews in the Arab world?
Well, of course, in nationalist propaganda, of course, people can say anything. One of which, of course, is that the Holocaust is simply an invention of the Jews and the Zionists. It never really was, and certainly not to the extent that they say it was, and so on and so forth. That's one. It's clear that many saw the Holocaust. There were those who said they got what they deserved. There were others who said that this was a terrible human tragedy. I mean, the widest variety of responses, and then of course you have the most militant nationalists who said there's the need for another. And not long ago, one of them had said that the slaughter on October 7th of the people at the celebration in southern Israel, that was Holocaust. That was the new Holocaust, but was said in a positive way. But that's not generally the Holocaust was looked as a great tragedy, but one which the Jews have again, I'm giving you now the nationalist point of view, that the Jews have exploited for their own purposes.
Then came 1948, the founding of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war and the Nakba. What changed for Jews in Arab countries?
Well, for one thing, now you had this Jewish state. You had, of course, again, I'm not here to argue politically, but just point out there was a resolution for partition. The Jews accepted it. The Palestinians and the Arab League, which represented them, did not. And of course, they then lost even more territory. And you have the Palestinian refugees at the time. And this created a whole new reality, a new balance in the Middle East. Large numbers of Jews left the Arab world, in some cases because their life was made to be completely unbearable, in some places because they simply wanted to leave. And by the way, in some places they had hopes for the future. North Africa. Then, of course, the French pull out of the two protectorates, and Algeria, which, remember, is not a colony. Algeria was part of France. It was 3 of the départements, the states of France, were in Algeria. And for many of them had hopes. That's why, yes, you had Zionism was very strong in Morocco, and you immediately had about 20,000 Moroccan. But by the way, North Africans had strong ties to the Holy Land. In the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, you have immigration to Ottoman Palestine. The city of Haifa more or less is rebuilt by North Africans starting in the 19th century. It's interesting. It shows you how times change. In rabbinical rulings, a husband who says he wants to go and live in the land of Israel, and his wife does not wish. At first, it said he had to give her the money from their marriage contract and give her a full divorce so that she can remarry and so on. But also with the money. Later on, in the second half of the 19th century, mid-19th second half, when things are more calm and stable in the Middle East, they rule if she doesn't want to come, she doesn't get her divorce money. She should be going with him. And so these ties, you had very close ties back and forth, especially with North African Jews. But the majority of Moroccan Jews stayed, in part because they had very strong ties, feelings for the royal family. The king of Morocco, Mohammed V, during World War II, when the Vichy laws are put into place for discrimination against Jews, makes it clear to the Jewish community he's totally against it, that he calls in the leaders of the community, gives them honors, and say, look, this is not my doing. Same thing with the Bey of Tunis. And they were looked upon to this day in the popular culture as if he saved the Jews from going to concentration camps in Europe. Of course, there were no railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz and Birkenau and so forth from North Africa. But the fact is, and later on, the French throw him out, put him in exile in Mozambique, and he only because he's a nationalist, but because of that, many Jews felt secure enough to stay. But then, of course, the politics of the street began to become more and more important. And also, when Morocco joined the Arab League, broke all contact with the state of Israel. Already, you had a large North African Jewish population there. People got cut off from their relatives, even by mail. Remember, you don't have cell phones and so on in the 1950s. And that's when, right after Morocco becomes independent and part of the Arab League and so on, that you have the huge exodus with a vast majority. But by the way, it still has the largest Jewish population of any Arab country. There are over there's some, we don't know exactly, between 2,000 and 2,500 Jews still living in Morocco. One of the reasons that we're not so sure is because young people very often go to study outside in France and elsewhere and don't come back, but they're still considered as if they're there. And I've been married into a Moroccan family for nearly, I'm bad in math, for 60 years.
Wow. For listeners new to this history, can you walk us through the exodus, including the numbers, the push and pull dynamics of flight and expulsion, how it played out differently in Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, and elsewhere, and the measures the governments took, such as legal restrictions, property seizures, or political targeting?
Okay. In most places, of course, if you left, the property was seized. You had a few, like, for example, the Safra family. I don't know if you've heard of Bank Safra. They're big in Europe as well. I know because one of my former students is about to become one of the heads of Bank Safra in Luxembourg. In any case, people like that, some of them were able to get their wealth out and so on. The vast majority did not and lost everything. In the case of Iraq made strict rules. Jews could leave, but they could only have a certain amount of luggage that they could carry, a small amount of pocket money, and everything else was to be lost. The French embassy in Baghdad, by the way, was the villa of one of the Jewish mercantile families, for example, which is now suing France to try to get some payment for them for the house, and this is what 70 years later. In the case of Morocco, the vast majority of the Jews decide to leave when Morocco becomes independent. When I started working in Morocco, there was still 30,000 Jews in 1971 living in the country. As I said, it's down. That was from 350, 400,000, now down to 2,000. But 30,000 was still not an insignificant number. In the case of Algeria, of course, they were French citizens overwhelmingly and went to France. What they had in Algeria was lost. In Tunisia also was more liberal on it. Guiba also had Jews in his cabinet in the first government when they become independent from France. Also, many Jews in Tunisia had at least dual citizenship. About 30,000 of the 100,000 Jews there had French citizenship. Only Algeria gave French citizenship to all the Jews automatically. In Morocco and in Tunisia, they wanted it, but you had to go through various processes, but they did get it more easily than others. Usually you had to be in some service to France. Again, the rules of Bourguiba was not that he was a Tunisian nationalist, not a Tunisia is a very small country. It's a very what shall I say, ethnically united population, not like the Middle East, which is so tribal, ethnic, and so on. For example, Tunisian Jews, even after they left, still continued to come back to Tunisia, especially if they had French passports or Canadian passports, for the pilgrimages. Until recently, when at the pilgrimage on the island of Jerba, one of the policemen, and this is the second time it happened a number of years ago as well, started shooting and killing Jewish tourists Tunisians who had come for the pilgrimage. Obviously, that's going to put a damper on it, but still, there was a certain relationship. Also, the new state of Israel and particularly the state of Morocco, but also with Tunisians, had under the cloth relations. The Israelis helped the Moroccans a great deal, the Moroccan king a great deal, among other things. One of his leading opponents was trying to overthrow him. They found where he was in Europe. The Moroccans asked if the Israelis could also eliminate him for them. They said, no, that's not their job. And the Moroccans did it instead. But remember, Morocco then had diplomatic relations with Israel, which it then broke off. It then renewed, and so on. But the relationships were good, and also in part because of after October 7th, King of Morocco, and Algeria, Morocco and Egypt, and the Emirates publicly condemned Hamas for this violence. Morocco, the Emirates, and Egypt blocked the Egyptian request at the meeting of the Arab League. The Iranians came as guests and put forth a request that the Arab League now turn against Israel to punish them for the invasion of Gaza, which of course came because of the invasion of Israel. And they blocked it, the Moroccans. And the king only made his first negative comments about the war going on in Gaza at the end of and that was at the end of October. At the beginning of November, when there started to be street demonstrations in Casablanca, in Marrakesh, and other places in Rabat, from the pro-Islamic forces and from the Arab nationalists are much smaller, but the pro-Islamic forces against Israel. And that's when he criticized Israel as having gone overboard in its reaction to what happened on October 7th, and that was harming innocent citizens itself. And that's a full month and a half after the war breaks out. And still in all, we just here in Israel, we just had a whole group of Moroccan academics who were here for a symposium that we had at one of the universities. Colleagues of mine from Muhammad V University, from Muli Ismail University, and so on, all Muslims. And we had the conference. They stayed and then toured the country a little bit, and then, thank goodness, went home, because they went. The conference went from Sunday night till Tuesday. They tour Wednesday, Thursday. They leave on Friday morning, and Friday night the war broke out with Iran and the shelling and so on. And so they weren't, thank goodness, here for that. And there's another conference scheduled for them to do with the Israelis in November in Morocco. So and one of my colleagues in international studies and security studies in Morocco, as she put it, relations are on a low light right now, but they're not going to break relations because Morocco and Israel have so much in common and so much cooperation still below the surface, and so that again. To show you things are not as simple as they were very often portrayed, either by propagandists or by the media and for example, we had a conference 3 years ago, the 100th anniversary of the great French novelist, Tunisian Jewish, of course, novelist and sociologist Albert Camus. Some of his books have been made into movies. Much of the study of colonialism and post-colonialism that people read in sociology departments at universities are his. His novel, The Pillar of Salt, is excellent. If you haven't read it, I actually had the honor of meeting him. He died at 99. And at the 100th anniversary of his birth, a year later, we had a conference on him, international. And my colleagues from the University of Tunis, several of whom have written about him and who write about the Jews of Tunisia and so on, asked could they be we did it by Zoom because it was just after COVID and so on. And the political situation, and we did it by Zoom for those who couldn't be here. And the one thing the Tunisians asked, could you not have our pictures up at the top of the screen with our names, because you have to understand the political situation. And of course, I was one of the organizers of the conference. I said, absolutely, of course we understand, because the new president of Tunisia happens to be particularly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and so on. But the general population is not.
When these refugees arrived in Israel, what challenges did they face in finding housing, work, and social acceptance? And how much did prejudice from the Ashkenazi majority shape their early decades in the country?
We just had a World Congress, and that was topic came up in one of the panels. So you're picking very, very good academic subjects. First of all, you have to remember, when Israel became independent, it was a poor country. There was the refugees came in. They were settled in, for the most part, tent camps, some of which lasted for years. And then in shacks. These were called ma'abarot, immigrant camps. My late wife lived in a tent for 2.5 years. Said it was very difficult. Winter, they all suffered from chilblains from the, of course, living in an unheated tent and so forth. There are a number of novels by people who immigrated from various Arab countries about the experience in the camps. As for what did they experience? Well, there was social prejudice. Despite what we all wish for, hope, and believe, prejudice is a fairly widespread human phenomenon and in many societies, and can be found for a vast variety of reasons, sometimes somewhat justifiable, sometimes not at all. The founding fathers of the state were mostly Ashkenazim, although not all, but were mostly so. And for them, and they were also, many of them had, even though they had suffered prejudice in Europe, they had a European formation of what was modernity, etc., what was society, what was administration, government, and so on. Haaretz, which today is Israel's leading left-wing newspaper. In 1949, had a somewhat different voice, and a famous editorial was we shouldn't be allowing all these Moroccans to come in. They're not only primitive people, but many of them are dishonest, etc., etc. So be it. In any case, that being said, and remember, I grew up in the United States when prejudice and you talk about apartheid, the whites and black outside of the South, there was still a great deal of prejudice against African Americans and so on. The civil rights movement it took place when I was a boy and continued all the way on to when I'm in college. So that I'm well aware of prejudice and what it is. But on the other hand, again, not to paint everything in these black and white colors. Education allowed for people to escape their socioeconomic confinements. And that was true in the States. That was true in Israel. Public education gave the new immigrants the ability to show that they're just as good, if not better, than everyone else. And and also you had leaders among the Sephardi community who also took an important role in public life. And my late wife, as I said, 2.5 years in a tent, then in new housing, all of 90 square meters for a family with this new housing that was put up very, very rapidly, but then goes on to the university, a PhD, and becomes the leading specialist. She became the leading specialist in the world on the history of material culture in the Islamic world. Her book on Arab clothing is translated to Arabic. It's used in universities all over the world, and many, many others as well. The other thing was that despite the prejudice, the social things like the fact that everyone had to serve in the army unless you were ultra-religious and so on, gave meeting points for people, aside from school, aside from the youth organizations and so on. And already by the 1970s, over 25% of all marriages were between Jews of the Middle East and so-called Ashkenazi Jews. And by the way, many of the Ashkenazi Jews, if you came from Romania, you came from Bulgaria, and so on, they were not that different than if you came from parts of Morocco or Tunisia or Lebanon, and so on. And today, of course, that number is much, much greater. And that also erased the ethnic boundaries to many in many ways. But it took time. It was not an instant process, just as it hasn't been in the United States either. But all in all, the prejudices of the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, for the most part, are gone, because it's not the new generation already grows up with a totally new identity.
In Israel today, how is the Exodus remembered officially, culturally, and within families?
That's actually of course, one of the way. At first, even in the academic world, this was not studied so much because the important things were either the Middle Ages, biblical times, or modern European Jewish history. But all of that begins to change. How this is remembered? It's remembered, first of all, in many writers have written about it, and there are excellent fiction novelists who have written about the whole experience, and including the experience of into the culture, including also, by the way, the prejudices that they suffered at the time. And I mentioned Elie Amir being one of them, Albert Memmi being another. Who else? A number. Oh, Beton. What's his first name? Can't think of it. He's a very fine poet. And actually, there was a commission here a number of years ago, the Beton Commission. They had asked me to be a member of it, to look at high school and junior high school, what they now call middle school textbooks. How well do they cover the history of the Jews who came from the Islamic world? It already was in the universities, but not so much in public school textbooks. And there have been major changes because of that. There are conferences, there are historical gatherings, there are, and of course, also world associations that have annual conferences and if you go on YouTube, there's one called Harif, which means spicy in Hebrew, Harif. It's the Association of Jews from Islamic countries in England. And when the COVID epidemic broke out, they started all these educational online programs that became so popular. They continue to this day. I've spoken for them many times. They have courses and so on. Harif, you can look them up. And all of the programs have been recorded. Another one out of South Africa, of all places, called Lockdown University, and they have done a huge amount on the Jewish emigration from the Islamic world and into Israel and so on. Jemena out of the United States, and as I said, there are many of these, and some of them are not necessarily the ones I'm on, but some of them are really good. And they're made for wide audiences. And of course, they have the visuals that you need. And here in Israel, we have programs. We have programs all the time for the general public. Again, so that this is recalled, understood, and so on. And it really has become part of modern Israeli history, not merely the Zionist pioneer movements and so on. And just remember, when the first Zionists of the Aliyah Rishonah, the first Aliyah of Zionist immigrants came here to work the land, whom did they find? They found several hundred Yemenite Jews who had come in 6 months before they did, for the exact same purpose, and who also were working the land. And by the time of World War I, there were already about 10,000 of them. Remember, this part of the world was interconnected. So yes, there are many programs and books and the cultural programs. And also, two things also helped. One, Sephardi music, which then became part of popular Israeli culture. At first, it was called the music of the bus stations, because that's where you would hear it playing on loud recordings and so on. But then it became popular music, and then the other thing, of course, is cuisine. The difference, Jewish, you'll forgive me, but Central and Eastern European cuisine is not the most gourmet cuisine in the world. And, I remember my two grandmothers, chicken soup with matzo balls and salt and pepper on the chicken Spices were practically unknown. And here, you know, couscous and all the Israeli cuisine. That's one of the things, of course, in the propaganda back and forth is Israelis took over and they call it Israeli cuisine, but this is our cuisine and so on. You hear Palestinians and Arabs and others say this, but actually, it became Israeli cuisine because it was the cuisine of what was over half of the population, and it was so much better.
We were talking about how the Exodus is remembered in Israel.
Yes.
And the next question is, how is it remembered in the Arab world, or is it remembered at all?
Obviously, it's remembered in a very different way. First of all, the foundation of the State of Israel is seen as part of the Nakba, the disaster, and that the Palestinian refugees, which is interesting because the creation of the refugees, the Jews were refugees too, but they were coming into their what they saw as their own land, B, with their own people, and so the notion of being a refugee, the Hebrew term for it is they were olim, and it comes from the biblical term to rise up. You leave the land of Israel or go to the Temple Mount in the Bible, and you go to the land of you are ole, you are ascending. You leave, you are descending, and that became the word for immigrant and for migrant, the opposite. They no longer use the yored because it obviously is rather insulting to say someone who leaves, he has gone down in the world. So now they use a modern word for migrant, but they still use the word ole for the immigrants. And it was seen by the Islamic world as, no, these are foreigners who came in, took this land, and so on. The fact that most of the land, at least up until the War of Independence, when many Arabs left, in some cases, they'll say it's Israeli propaganda. It's partially true. It's not in every case true, but in many places, the Arab media told Arabs to leave so that they wouldn't stand in the way when they came in and reconquered it, and then, of course, they'd get it all back. But there were other places where they were driven out. Again, tendency is to paint everything into single colors and dimensions. But in any case, this was the Nakba. This was the disaster. The Arabs who left the mandate of Palestine, of what became Israel, the majority of people in Jordan, after all, Jordan didn't exist in any case. Transjordan was created as a consolation prize for the Husainids of Medina, who now lost Arabia to the family of the Saudis. But the majority are Palestinians. Many of them are now Jordanian, but in many places they were maintained as non-citizens, as refugees in Syria, in Lebanon, because this was A, hope they would go back, and B, a card in the political struggle with the new state of Israel. Of course, once you go this is already 3 full generations, almost 4 generations later, that basically held them in that status all the way up till now. I remember when I went in Lebanon, just going from the airport into Beirut, you passed through the refugee camps. many of these are full towns, in some places actual cities. But the status is, and part of it was that the local Lebanon had a tough enough political life as it was, divided amongst Sunnis, Shi'is, Lebanese Christians, and Druze. They didn't need to add to the Sunni population, and so they themselves didn't want to integrate them into the population. And of course, Lebanon is still suffering from this problem. But that's another story.
Last but not least, what do you hope the next generation, whether Jewish, Arab, or neither, will take from this story and the long history of Jews in the Arab world?
Well, one of the things I would hope that they would take from it all was that they had an important place in not only the history of the Arab world, but in their own history. Within Jewish history, they had an important place. Some of the leading thinkers, some of the leading creators of culture, the greatest poetry in Hebrew was created in what was the Islamic world, following the model of Arabic poetry. Secular poetry had disappeared with the destruction of the Jewish state in 70 and the destruction of the temple. There was only religious liturgical poetry that was left, and it wasn't, I must say, the greatest of all. And then you have this flowering of poetry in the Middle Ages in the Islamic world, which continued in Europe. Great Hebrew poetry only gets starting to be written in the 19th century with the Haskalah, the Jewish Renaissance or Enlightenment of modern Jewish culture. Up till that time, no. And yes, you had poetry. Of course you had poetry, but it was a very popular form, or it was in the local Jewish language, in Yiddish, for example. But Hebrew poetry? No. Until the 19th century in Europe, no. There really was there was very little. A little liturgical poetry, yes, but that's it. And that what would I like people, for example, in the Islamic world, to see that here was was an important part of the greater culture of the Dar al-Islam, of the Islamic world in its heyday, and that unfortunately the Islamic world turned in on itself to a great extent as the Middle Ages went on. And this part of the population, in any case, by the 19th century, saw its future elsewhere. And there were, by the way, these waves, as I pointed out to you, of immigration to the Holy Land. There were those who said, no, you have to wait for the coming of the Messiah. And then there were those who said, already in the 10th century. And in any case, to see that they also became an important part of this new state of Israel. And hopefully there will be, I hope for greater understanding from all sides. And again, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but this it's in my nature.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
That being said, this marks the end of our podcast. To you, Professor Stillman, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, for taking the time, a lot of time, answering all of our questions and doubts.
That's a long story.
It is, indeed.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you, and
likewise.
And I hope sometime we'll really meet in person.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.